He walked into a roadside café in Vietnam to escape the rain and found a forgotten American soldier bathing a disabled child. 12 hours later, Keanu Reeves realized this man had saved more lives after the war than during it. But why did he stay behind when everyone else left? And what secret was he carrying all these years? Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The countryside blurred past the rain-specked window as Keanu sat in the back of the small passenger van. The hum of the road mixed with the rhythmic patter of light drizzle on the glass. He hadn't spoken much since Hanoi. There wasn't anything to say. Not here, not on this trip. Vietnam wasn't part of a press tour or a film project. It wasn't for a role. It was personal. A faded map rested beside him. Locations were circled in red. Names barely legible. One of them was Quang Nam Province, near a place his father had once mentioned in a rare, late-night conversation more than 30 years ago. Keanu couldn't recall much about that exchange except the tone. It wasn't nostalgia. It was regret. His father had served in-country during the war, a quiet part of his past that rarely surfaced, except in glances and unfinished sentences. Now Keanu was walking those shadows, not to uncover anything for the world, but maybe to make peace with something unspoken. The places, the people, the aftermath. It felt right to see them for himself. The van dropped him off just outside Da Nang. He nodded to the driver, shouldered his weather-worn bag, and walked along the narrow roadside in silence. The clouds had thickened. The air smelled like wet dust and rice paddies. By the time the rain started, it was heavy and fast. There were no hotels in sight, just fields, scattered homes, and one old hand-painted sign barely standing against the wind. It pointed to a small café tucked behind a wall of banana trees. No cars out front, just a single motorbike and the sound of children laughing faintly in the distance. Keanu pushed open the door, soaked to the bone. His clothes clung to him, and water dripped from his sleeves. Inside, the cafe was dim and quiet. Wooden tables, no menu boards, no Wi-Fi. The kind of place travelers might pass without notice. There were 3 people inside. A woman behind the counter, mid-30s, nodding gently as he entered. A young Vietnamese boy, no older than 10, sitting on a small plastic stool, legs visibly deformed, twisted inward, feet curled unnaturally. And beside him, kneeling with a damp towel in a steady hand, was an older American man, late 60s, maybe older, wearing a threadbare t-shirt and a baseball cap that had seen better decades. The man dipped the towel in a bowl of warm water and gently patted the boy's face, wiping away sweat and dirt. He murmured something in Vietnamese, and the boy giggled. Keanu stood still, watching, unmoving. He didn't know why, but his heart beat harder than the walk had earned. Something about the man, his posture, his gentleness, the way he moved like this was his whole world, made Keanu forget the rain altogether. He took a seat in the far corner and just watched. The room smelled faintly of steamed rice, damp wood, and something floral from the open window. Keanu sat without speaking, rainwater still trailing down the back of his neck. The old fan above him creaked with each rotation, stirring the humidity just enough to keep the air from turning heavy. He kept his eyes on the man and the boy. There was something in the rhythm of their interaction that didn't feel clinical. It wasn't charity. It wasn't obligation. It was deeper. The boy leaned into the man's hand with complete trust, his crooked legs limp, but at ease. When the towel dipped again into the bowl and came back to gently wipe the boy's arms, the man hummed, just a low, tuneless vibration, like something passed down unconsciously. The woman behind the counter approached Keanu softly, placing a chipped ceramic cup of tea on his table. Her eyes flicked to the man near the boy, then back to Keanu. She smiled, gently, and whispered, Frank. Keanu nodded politely, but said nothing. He turned the name over in his mind. Frank. The man didn't acknowledge him. Not out of rudeness, but because his attention was elsewhere. Centered. Present. The kind of focus that didn't allow for distraction. Keanu understood that. He respected it. After a while, the man gently lifted the boy from the stool and onto a thin mat laid out on a raised platform near the wall. The boy's body was stiff, uncooperative, but the man moved with ease, adjusting limbs without hesitation. He covered the boy with a light blanket, patted his chest twice, and whispered something in Vietnamese that Keanu couldn't quite hear. The boy grinned and shut his eyes. Only then did the man rise and turn toward the café. He moved with a limp, slight but noticeable. His back wasn't perfectly straight, and his steps were careful. He nodded toward the woman behind the counter, then noticed Keanu for the first time. Their eyes met. There was no spark of recognition, no fanfare, just a quiet exchange between two men who had learned to live more by observation than by words. The man nodded once. Keanu returned it. He didn't approach, didn't ask anything, just walked slowly to a seat by the window and sat down. His hand reached for the tea the woman had placed for him, but he didn't drink. Outside, the rain softened. Inside, silence lingered. Keanu had traveled thousands of miles to walk through someone else's memory. Instead, he had walked straight into a living wall, and he wasn't sure why it felt so familiar. The room smelled faintly of steamed rice, damp wood, and something floral from the open window. Keanu sat without speaking, rainwater still trailing down the back of his neck. The old fan above him creaked with each rotation, stirring the humidity just enough to keep the air from turning heavy. He kept his eyes on the man and the boy. There was something in the rhythm of their interaction that didn't feel clinical. It wasn't charity. It wasn't obligation. It was deeper. The boy leaned into the man's hand with complete trust, his crooked legs limp but at ease. When the towel dipped again into the bowl and came back to gently wipe the boy's arms, the man hummed just a low, tuneless vibration, like something passed down unconsciously. The woman behind the counter approached Keanu softly, placing a chipped ceramic cup of tea on his table. Her eyes flicked to the man near the boy, then back to Keanu. She smiled, gently, and whispered, Frank. Keanu nodded politely but said nothing. He turned the name over in his mind. Frank. The man didn't acknowledge him, not out of rudeness, but because his attention was elsewhere, centered, present. The kind of focus that didn't allow for distraction. Keanu understood that. He respected it. After a while, the man gently lifted the boy from the stool and onto a thin mat laid out on a raised platform near the wall. The boy's body was stiff, uncooperative, but the man moved with ease, adjusting limbs without hesitation. He covered the boy with a light blanket, patted his chest twice, and whispered something in Vietnamese that Keanu couldn't quite hear. The boy grinned and shut his eyes. Only then did the man rise and turn toward the café. He moved with a limp, slight but noticeable. His back wasn't perfectly straight, and his steps were careful. He nodded toward the woman behind the counter, then noticed Keanu for the first time. Their eyes met. There was no spark of recognition, no fanfare, just a quiet exchange between two men who had learned to live more by observation than by words. The man nodded once. Keanu returned it. He didn't approach, didn't ask anything, just walked slowly to a seat by the window and sat down. His hand reached for the tea the woman had placed for him, but he didn't drink. Outside, the rain softened. Inside, silence lingered. Keanu had traveled thousands of miles to walk through someone else's memory. Instead, he had walked straight into a living one, and he wasn't sure why it felt so familiar. The next morning, Keanu returned to the cafe before the sun had fully broken through the clouds. The sky was overcast, the streets quiet except for the distant rattle of a bicycle bell and the soft bark of a dog. He wore the same weathered jacket from the night before, now dry, but still smelling faintly of damp earth and travel. He didn't know why he'd come back, only that he couldn't not come back. The same faded sign greeted him at the roadside. The same banana trees framed the path. The cafe looked exactly as it had yesterday. Small, weather-worn, unchanged. But something in Keanu's chest shifted as he stepped through the doorway again. This time, the boy was awake. Sitting on the mat again, watching a local cartoon playing silently on a small old television. The woman behind the counter smiled when she saw Keanu. Not surprised, not intrusive, just a knowing look, like she'd expected him. Frank was there too, sitting at the same table, sipping tea, legs stretched under the table with a relaxed, familiar posture. He looked up and gave a short nod. Keanu approached, stopped just a step away. "Mind if I sit?" Frank gestured to the chair across from him. "It's open, isn't it?" Keanu took the seat and rested his hands on the edge of the table. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Frank broke the silence. "You look better dry." Keanu chuckled lightly. "I took your advice." Frank gave a grunt that might have been a laugh. "That's rare." Keanu glanced toward the boy. "He doing okay?" "As okay as he can be," Frank said. His name's Min, born with severe deformities from second-gen exposure. His mother used to work the fields where they sprayed. Didn't even know she was pregnant until her 3rd month. Keanu looked back toward the child. He smiled a lot, even yesterday. Frank nodded. "Yeah, that one's pure light, even with the pain, even with the legs." He paused, then added, "That's what keeps me here." Keanu leaned back slightly. "I was going to ask." Frank raised an eyebrow. "Why I stayed?" Keanu nodded. Frank took a sip of tea, then set the cup down gently. "I came here in '71, Army medic. Quang Tri and Da Nang mostly, fixed bodies that were half broken and souls that were worse. Thought I'd seen it all." He paused. "Until I saw what the war left behind." He motioned toward Min. Harry pulled his Q-door apron. "Dabby don't teach you that part in boot camp." Keanu listened, his face unreadable but focused. Frank folded his hands on the table. "I left in '73 like everyone else. Got sent home. Got the medals. Got the nightmares. But I couldn't get the faces out of my head. The kids, the mothers, the ones who didn't pick a side, just happened to be in the way." Keanu asked quietly, "So, you came back?" Frank nodded once. "In '81, and I never left again." Keanu took a long breath, absorbing Frank's words in silence. The morning light filtered through the wooden slats of the window, casting a soft haze across the cafe floor. "What brought you back?" Keanu asked. Frank's eyes narrowed slightly. Not in suspicion, but in memory. Guilt, mostly. And purpose. "I couldn't sleep in a house in Wisconsin, knowing the same kids I'd bandaged were raising children with broken spines and missing fingers. I couldn't get used to clean grocery aisles, while I knew people here were still boiling water over tin fires to sterilize wounds." He paused, searching for the right words. "I guess I didn't just leave the war. I left something unfinished." Keanu looked toward Min again. "But staying meant letting go of your old life." Frank smiled faintly. "Old life didn't miss me much. One brother who barely wrote, a few friends who drank themselves into silence. I came back here with one duffel bag and a few Army-issued skills. That's all." "You make it sound like it was simple." "It wasn't," Frank said, "but it was clear." The woman brought over 2 bowls of pho, setting them down gently. Keanu offered a quiet thank you. Frank nodded at her with familiarity, like someone who had watched her grow up. As they ate, Frank continued. "For the first few years, I just moved from village to village, helped where I could, pulled teeth, cleaned wounds, gave morphine when it was available, learned the language badly, got laughed at a lot, but eventually people started calling me Baxi Mai, the American doctor. Keanu smiled softly. "You're not a doctor, are you?" "Not even close," Frank said. "But when you're the only one showing up, people don't ask for a license." The two men ate quietly for a moment. Outside, a motorbike passed. A child laughed. Frank set his spoon down. "People think I'm crazy. An American who stayed behind, living off scrap and goodwill, but they don't see what I see." "What do you see?" Frank's voice lowered. "The aftermath, not in numbers, in people. Min is the fourth child in his family born like this. His oldest sister died before she was 3, and no one ever came to say sorry. No country, no company, just a shrug and a footnote in a textbook." Keanu felt a tightness in his chest. "But you stayed." "I did, and I'll keep staying." He looked at Keanu, steady and calm. "These are my people now." Keanu didn't respond right away. He didn't need to. The weight of those 5 words filled the space completely. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The clink of spoons, the distant hum of village life, and the soft breathing of Min sleeping nearby filled the room with a gentle kind of rhythm. It wasn't awkward silence. It was the kind that only comes when both people understand something heavy just settled between them, and neither wants to rush through it. Keanu finally broke the quiet. "I've traveled a lot," he said. "Worked with foundations, charities. I've met people who've done good. But this feels different." Frank looked at him. "It's not better, just quieter." Keanu nodded. "That's exactly it. It's not loud, it's real." Frank chuckled lightly. "I stopped trying to fix the system a long time ago. Couldn't win that fight. But I figured if I could ease the pain in just 1 square kilometer, maybe that was enough." Keanu tilted his head. "And has it been?" Frank thought for a moment, then nodded. "Most days. I'm not a saint, Keanu. I've made mistakes, missed signs, lost people. But I stayed. And sometimes that's what people need more than anything. Someone who stays." Keanu leaned back, his gaze drifting to the boy again. "You're a contradiction, Frank. You're forgotten back home, but you're revered here." Finch shrugged. "I didn't come to be remembered. I came to not forget." Keanu looked back at him. "That's the kind of thing people should hear." "They boy don't want to," Frank said. "They want closure, clean narratives, heroes and villains. This place doesn't offer that. Just layers, just lives." For a moment, Keanu wondered what it would feel like to live this way. Not for a weekend, not as a guest, but to trade one world for another and commit to carrying stories no one else would carry. "I think you've built something here," he said quietly. "Something no camera could ever capture." Frank raised an eyebrow. "Then maybe don't try." Keanu smiled, but the expression faded into something more thoughtful. "Would you be okay if the world did see it? Not through fiction, but truth?" Frank was quiet. Then he said, "As long as they don't turn it into a movie." Keanu nodded. "That's not what I'm here for." "Then we'll see," Frank said. "Stick around, help out, get your hands dirty. If you still want to tell the story after that, maybe I'll believe you." Keanu extended a hand. Frank looked at it, then shook it with a firm, weathered grip. "All right then," he said. "You've got 1 day." Keanu smiled. "Then I'll make it count." Outside, the clouds began to part, letting in streaks of sunlight. Inside, something deeper had already begun to shine. The sun was higher by the time Frank finished his tea. Keanu helped him clear the dishes, ignoring the woman's attempts to shoo him away. He didn't speak much. Something had shifted in him since that first quiet meal. Words didn't seem to fit. Not here. After they finished, Frank waved someone over from the doorway. A woman stepped inside with a bag slung across her shoulder and a small notepad in her hand. She was in her 30s, calm and composed, with the quiet confidence of someone used to navigating multiple worlds at once. "This is Lynn," Frank said. "Interpreter, fixer, local saint. She's been helping me organize the new shelter." Lynn extended a hand to Keanu. "I know who you are, but don't worry, nobody else here does. They think you're just another tired Westerner." Keanu smiled, shaking her hand. "That's good. I'd rather keep it that way." Frank clapped Lynn on the shoulder. "He wants the real tour." Lynn looked at Keanu, her expression softening. "You sure?" "I'm sure," he said. "All right then," she replied. "Let's show you what Frank calls home." They walked through winding dirt alleys, past homes made of corrugated metal and weather-stained bamboo, where children played barefoot in puddles and mothers cooked over open fires. Lynn explained that the shelter wasn't far, just past the rice fields on the village's western edge. Along the way, they passed murals on crumbling walls, paintings of doves, wheelchairs, hearts, and the faded figure of a man helping lift a child. Keanu recognized the figure immediately. "That's Frank." Lynn nodded. "They painted it 5 years ago. After he rebuilt the clinic, it was destroyed in a flood." "Who funds all this?" She smiled. "Sometimes no one. Sometimes a small grant. Most of the time, Frank just makes it work. He barters, he builds, he teaches others how to do the rest." They rounded a bend, and the shelter came into view. He was humble. Concrete walls, patched with bamboo and plastic. The roof was uneven in parts, but it stood strong. Outside, a group of children sat on mats drawing with colored chalk. A teenage girl helped one boy hold a crayon between twisted fingers. None of them turned to look as Keanu approached. They were used to visitors, but not the kind who stayed. Lynn led him inside. There were 6 rooms. 3 housed children who required around-the-clock care. 2 were classrooms. 1 was a kitchen. The air was warm. Clean, but filled with the scent of medicine, rice, and rain-soaked cloth. "This," Lynch said softly, "is where the war never ended." Keanu followed Lynn into the first room, where the ceiling hung low and a faint fan rotated above 3 narrow beds. A child no older than 5 lay curled up on the mattress nearest the door. His head was disproportionately large, his arms frail. A soft moan escaped his lips as he stirred in the sheets. Lynn moved beside him, gently adjusting the pillow under his head. "His name is Bao," she said. "Hydrocephalus. His mother left when he was 2. Frank takes shifts here when the volunteer nurse is off." Keanu knelt beside the bed. The boy's eyes fluttered open for a moment, then closed again. There was no fear, just exhaustion. Keanu brushed his hand across the side of the mattress. He didn't speak. The next room was smaller. Inside, a teenage girl sat in a wheelchair, singing softly to herself. She had no legs below the knees and wore a scarf to cover burn marks on her neck. When she saw them enter, she smiled wide and pointed toward the window. "Team likes the rain," Lynn translated. "Says it makes her feel clean." Keanu walked over and opened the shutters slightly. Cool air swept in. The girl lifted her face and closed her eyes. In the courtyard, Frank had joined a boy in helping fix a broken pipe that ran from the rooftop into a water barrel. He held the wrench in place while the boy steadied the connector. Mud stained his arms up to the elbows. He moved slowly but without hesitation. "Most people think of Frank as a caregiver," Lynn said, watching him. "But he's also the handyman, the cook, the plumber. Whatever the day needs, that's who he becomes." They returned outside. Frank noticed them and nodded toward the girl in the wheelchair. "Mylin," he called. "Tell her Keanu opened the window." She beamed and gave Keanu a thumbs up. "You're already part of the story," Frank said. Keanu chuckled, wiping a streak of dirt off his hand. "Feels more like I'm just part of the work crew." Frank tossed him a small hammer, then grabbed that tarp. Roof's been leaking again. Within minutes, Keanu was up on a rickety ladder, steadying a sheet of tin while Frank nailed it into place. A few children stood below, pointing and laughing as one of the world's most recognizable actors fumbled with a roofing job. But here, none of that mattered. Keanu Reeves was just another pair of hands, and for the first time in a long while, that felt like enough. He in turn underscore 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 non-panic, non-piss-cascal, a son of. By mid-afternoon, Keanu had stopped thinking about who he was supposed to be. He wasn't the actor, or the guest, or the outsider. He was a man with a hammer in one hand and sweat running down the back of his neck. His jeans were streaked with mud, his palms were sore. He didn't care. After the roofing patch was finished, he helped Lynn bring in lunch from the outdoor kitchen. Plain rice, greens, and broth. The children sat in a circle on woven mats. Some needed help eating. Frank moved from child to child with quiet familiarity. He spoon-fed a blind girl named Thu with steady hands, joking with her as she giggled and tapped his chin. Keanu watched, then knelt beside another boy with missing fingers who struggled to grip his chopsticks. Without a word, Keanu adjusted the boy's grip, wrapped the child's hand around the spoon, and guided the motion until the boy could manage a few bites on his own. The smile that followed broke something open inside Keanu that he hadn't realized was still locked up. Later, as they cleaned dishes and metal basins under the shade of a tarp, Frank handed Keanu a cloth and nodded toward a tilted faucet. "You any good with plumbing?" Keanu shrugged. "Better with wiring." Frank grinned. "Then you're promoted. The solar light in the girls' room hasn't worked in weeks." It wasn't a test, it was trust. Keanu followed him inside, climbed a small stool and fiddled with the panel. A loose wire. A bit of dust. When the light flickered on, a small cheer erupted from behind him. Two girls clapped and giggled. Keanu gave a mock bow. One threw a crumpled napkin at his head. He laughed. At the end of the day, Keanu sat under a mango tree behind the shelter, breathing in the quiet. Lynn brought him a bottle of water and sat beside him. "You all right?" she asked. He nodded. "I think so. What are you thinking?" Keanu looked toward the shelter, where Frank sat weaving a mat with two boys, his hands moving slowly, rhythmically. I've been all over the world, and I've never seen anything like this." "This place?" "No," Keanu said. "This man." Lynn folded her arms and smiled. "He doesn't want to be seen." "I know," Keanu replied, "but people need to." He didn't say it for praise or for a plan. He said it because the world had passed Frank Dawson by. And somehow, in this corner of Vietnam, surrounded by children born into silence, Frank had made that silence a home. The next morning, Keanu and Frank walked through the village just after sunrise. The streets were still quiet, lit in soft gold and framed by trees swaying gently in the morning breeze. The air was cooler, cleaner. The children were still asleep at the shelter. Lynn had gone to the market for supplies. It was the first time Keanu had seen Frank move without the rhythm of caretaking behind him. They walked slowly, side by side, through fields that had once been battle zones. The echoes were invisible now, covered in green, but Keanu felt them. Frank spoke as they walked, his voice calm and even. "When I got sent home in '73, I thought that was the end of the story. I figured I'd go back, get a job, maybe drink less. Instead, I spent 5 years falling apart." Keanu said nothing, just listened. "I had nightmares I couldn't explain to people who didn't want to hear them. Couldn't hold a job, couldn't stay sober. I woke up one morning in a truck bed in Georgia. Didn't know how I'd gotten there. That was the day I realized I was still lost in a war that had already ended." Keanu glanced at him. "Is that when you decided to come back?" Frank nodded. Yeah, 1981. I got on a plane with 2 bags and a handwritten letter of recommendation from a priest who said I had a good heart, just too much noise in my head. He smiled faintly. It was the first time someone didn't try to fix me, just believed I had something left. They stopped by a fence where a man waved from behind a row of chickens. Frank waved back. I started in Hue, found a Catholic mission that needed hands, stayed there for a few years, rebuilt classrooms, laid bricks, cleaned wounds. Didn't ask for pay, just food and a roof. You didn't use the VA? Keanu asked. Frank snorted. Tried once. Spent 4 hours filling out paperwork. They told me I wasn't prioritized. I didn't go back. The forms were heavier than the trauma. Keanu shook his head slowly. Frank glanced at him. Don't get me wrong. I don't hate America. I just don't need it to tell me I'm useful. They started walking again. After the mission, I moved south. Da Nang felt unfinished. I remembered the kids here, the ones I'd treated in 71. Some of them were still around. Some of their kids were the ones being born with deformities. Keanu looked out at the distant fields shimmering in the sun. You stayed. For them. I stayed, Frank said, because no one else did. They walked in silence for a while longer, passing a row of homes made from patched concrete and salvaged wood. Elderly women swept their steps with handmade brooms. A young man on a bicycle offered Frank a loaf of bread from his basket. Frank accepted it with a nod and handed half to Keanu. This is how it works here, Frank said. You give what you can, you take what you need. Keanu took the bread but didn't eat it right away. How long have you lived this way? Frank shrugged. 42 years. On and off. Mostly on. Keanu glanced at him. But no one ever reached out? No news outlet, no medal, nothing? Frank smiled, but there was no bitterness in it. Nope. No headlines. I wasn't part of some grand operation. I wasn't in the famous battles. I was the guy dragging wounded kids to safety, bandaging legs, calming down a dying soldier in a field. It wasn't glory. It was just surviving. And when it was over, I figured the survivors needed more than a parade. They turned a corner, passing the edge of the village where a narrow path opened toward the river. Frank stopped and looked out across the water. That's where I treated my first Vietnamese patient in 71. She was 10, burned over half her body. She didn't make it. I think that moment carved a hole in me I never filled back home. Keanu's gaze dropped. You carried all that alone. Frank shook his head. Not alone, just quietly. He turned and looked Keanu straight in the eye. I didn't come here to be remembered. I came here to make sure someone else was. Keanu felt the words hit deeper than anything he'd heard in months, maybe years. You've done that, he said quietly. Frank gave a small nod. Not enough, but I try. They headed back toward the shelter, the village slowly waking behind them. Roosters crowed, water buckets were hauled. Smoke drifted from cooking fires. I live on donations mostly, Frank said. Odd jobs when I can. The locals help me more than I help them some days. I fix their roofs, they fix my dignity. That's the real trade. Keanu smiled. You ever think about going home? Frank chuckled. This is home. Then he added more softly, besides, if I leave, who's going to fix the solar panel you botched yesterday? Keanu laughed for the first time all morning, and Frank joined him. Later that evening, after the sun had dipped low and the shelter children were tucked into bed, Keanu sat with Frank and Lean under the awning outside the café. A single bulb swayed gently above them, flickering slightly with the breeze. The day had left Keanu dusty, sore, and strangely content. Frank was rolling a cigarette, his fingers moving with practiced ease. Lynn sipped tea, legs crossed, notebook open beside her. Keanu broke the silence. There's a word people use back home, hero. They hand it out like candy. You fit it better than most I've met. Frank snorted. Hero's just a word people use when they don't want to get involved themselves. Lynn looked up. You don't think what you've done is heroic? I think it's decent, Frank replied. I think it's necessary, but heroic? No. Heroism is loud. What we do here is quiet. It doesn't get medals, it gets sorebacks and gray hair. Keanu leaned forward. Still, someone should have told your story. Frank exhaled slowly, lighting the end of his cigarette. Then, maybe you're here for a reason. Keanu considered that. He looked at Lynn. Has anyone documented this? Not just Frank, but the others? The kids, the caretakers, the history? She shook her head. A few locals have written papers, some footage here and there, but nothing sustained, nothing global. Frank added, and I'm not looking to be someone's project. I've had enough of that. Keanu nodded. I wouldn't do that to you, but people need to see what perseverance really looks like. Frank chuckled. You mean without the soundtrack and the dramatic monologue? Keanu smiled. Something like that. Frank leaned back in his chair. If you do tell it real. No savior narrative, no soft focus, just dirt and laughter and people doing the best they can. Keanu reached into his bag and pulled out a small leather notebook. He'd been writing in it every night since arriving. I'll start with that. Frank didn't answer, but he didn't object either. After a while, he stood and stretched. I've got morning rounds at 6, and you've got more than roofing ahead of you tomorrow. Keanu rose, looking forward to it. Frank gave a lazy salute. Night, Len. Night, Keanu. He disappeared into the darkness, his steps slow but steady. Lynn watched him go, then turned to Keanu. He may not want the spotlight, but he deserves to be seen. Keanu looked toward the shelter, where soft light glowed behind a curtain. It will be, he said. He already is. The next morning, Keanu kept a small camera in his pocket, wrapped in a cloth to keep dust out. He didn't bring it out right away. He waited, observed, and when the moment felt right, he started filming, not with intrusion, but with reverence. He captured Frank spoon-feeding two beneath the shaded porch, singing softly in Vietnamese with a heavy American accent. The lullaby was off-key, but gentle. It made the girl laugh between bites. He filmed Min trying to balance on his crutches, wobbling like a baby deer, while Frank walked beside him with patient encouragement. Not once did Frank raise his voice or rush the child. He just walked slowly, one step behind. He recorded Frank fixing a wheelchair with duct tape and wire, smiling as two boys handed him tools. When they got the brake to work, they all clapped. One of the boys held up a crooked thumb and said, "Ang Frank Jiu Qua." Grandpa Frank is amazing. Keanu never interrupted, he didn't stage anything. He didn't speak unless spoken to. He let the moments unfold. Frank noticed the camera. Of course he did. He glanced at it once or twice, but said nothing. By midday, Keanu had hours of footage. Nothing dramatic, nothing explosive, just a man moving through a village like he belonged to every corner of it. Later that afternoon, he followed Frank to the river, where he helped wash laundry for a group of elders too weak to carry the buckets themselves. Keanu recorded their laughter as Frank slipped in the mud, cursing under his breath before joining in with them. Then came the quiet moments. Frank rubbing ointment on a boy's feet, kneeling on a mat with bare knees and scarred hands. Frank helping a blind girl count out change at a market stall. Frank waiting patiently while a mute child tried to sign the word, "Thank you." Keanu didn't ask for permission. He didn't have to. Frank gave it by never asking him to stop. As the sun set behind the hills, casting long shadows over the village, Keanu returned to his room above the café. He set up the small camera on the rickety desk and watched the footage in silence. Frank's voice came through the speaker, humming that lullaby again. The screen showed him wiping sweat from a child's brow, smiling like this was the best part of his day. Keanu leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his eyes locked on the screen. and without even realizing it, the tears started to fall. He let the footage play in the background as he opened his journal. The pages were damp at the corners from the humidity, curled and well-worn from weeks of use. He picked up his pen and wrote slowly, as if the words needed to be felt before they were captured. How can one man carry so much and still smile? He paused, stared at that single sentence, and underlined it twice. Keanu's mind drifted, uninvited, to his father. He remembered the silence in their house growing up, the unspoken tension, the long absences, the empty chair at the table. His father had served too, long before addiction took hold. Vietnam had left its mark, but it wasn't the war that broke him. It was what followed. What if someone like Frank had reached him? That thought pressed hard against his chest. He didn't grow up with bedtime stories or warm shoulders to lean on. He'd learned to become his own guard, his own compass. But here was Frank. No armor, no mask, just a life of doing what was right when no one else was watching. Keanu closed the journal, setting the pen down gently. He turned back to the screen. Frank was laughing with a child who'd just spilled soup across the floor. No anger, no frustration. Just a calm voice and a towel to clean it up. He fast-forwarded. The next clip showed Frank lifting a teenager with severe scoliosis into a hammock. The boy clung to his neck briefly before relaxing into the swaying fabric. Frank patted his chest and whispered something Keanu couldn't quite make out. Keanu leaned closer, turned up the volume. Frank had said, "You're stronger than you know." He sat back and wiped at his face again. There was nothing flashy about any of it. No viral moment, no miraculous transformation. Just day after day of showing up, bending down, listening. And it was more powerful than anything Keanu had ever read in a script. He opened the camera again, clicked through more clips, and began tagging each one, not for editing, not yet, just for remembering. He wasn't sure what this footage would become, but he knew it had to mean something. Something more than just another day in a forgotten village. Something more than one man and a group of children caught in the aftermath of someone else's war. Something that finally showed what it meant to stay when everyone else had left. The next morning, Keanu woke early. The sounds of the village were already stirring. The clatter of pans, the crowing of roosters, the sweep of brooms along packed dirt. But his mind was still fixed on the night before. He sat on the edge of the bed, the journal open beside him. He ran a hand over the pages, his thoughts still tangled around the image of Frank singing in broken Vietnamese, still hearing the boys' laughter, still seeing the quiet strength in every mundane action. He'd known men who spoke loud about heroism. He'd worked with charities, seen fundraising campaigns, been told where to look and when to feel. But no one had ever shown him something like this. Not with noise, with silence. He thought again about his father. Not the man in the war, but the man who never figured out how to come home afterward. Keanu had tried to understand him for years. But maybe understanding hadn't been what mattered. Maybe it was the act of bearing witness to someone else's healing that brought its own kind of clarity. He looked out the window toward the shelter. Frank was already up, sweeping the courtyard, pausing to stretch his back now and then, muttering instructions to a teenage boy learning how to hold a mop properly. Keanu lifted the camera again and filmed from a distance. He zoomed in on Frank's weathered hands, on the child's shy smile, on the little moments that no one outside this village would ever think twice about, but that here were everything. It wasn't just about caregiving. It was about presence. Keanu lowered the camera and closed his eyes. He didn't want to just film what Frank was doing. He wanted to understand what it cost to give yourself away like that, piece by piece, without asking for anything back. Later that afternoon, while helping Frank repair the door to the storage room, Keanu finally spoke. "Do you ever wish someone told your story?" Frank wiped sweat from his brow, eyes focused on the rusted hinge. Stories are for people who need to remember. I've got no use for remembering. I'm too busy living." Keanu smiled softly, not because it was funny, but because it was exactly the answer he expected. That night he played the footage again, not to edit it, not to shape it, to remind himself that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is bear witness and never forget what you saw. The evening air hung thick with the smell of rain-soaked soil and distant cooking fires. Frank and Keanu sat beneath the shelter's overhang, watching the clouds roll low and slow over the distant hills. The children were asleep. Lynn had gone home for the night. It was just the two of them now. Feet stretched, boots untied, the kind of silence that didn't need to be filled. Keanu passed Frank a cup of cooled tea. Frank took it without looking up. "Ever tell you about my wife?" he asked. Keanu shook his head. "No." Frank nodded slowly. He stared out at the darkened horizon, the steam from his tea curling upward and vanishing into the air. Her name was Liane. She was a nurse in a clinic near Hue. That's where we met. This must have been 1983. I'd been working at a church hospital, doing night shifts and fixing broken floor tiles by day. She walked in with a first aid kit and a mouth that could command an entire room without raising her voice. Keanu smiled faintly. "Sounds like someone I'd be afraid of." Frank chuckled, eyes still forward. "I was. First thing she said to me was, 'Don't try to impress me, just clean those scissors right.' And I did. Every day after that." He sipped the tea, then set it down slowly. "We got married 2 years later. Didn't have a big ceremony, just a blessing from a local monk and a meal with the clinic staff. She wore a white aodai, and I wore the one shirt I owned that didn't have a rip in the sleeve." Frank finally looked over at Keanu, his expression softer now. "She didn't care about where I was from. She cared about where I stood, what I did, and how I treated the people around me. Lean taught me that you don't have to change the world. You just have to show up for the part that needs you." Keanu leaned forward, elbows on his knees, listening carefully. "We ran this place together," Frank said, motioning toward the shelter. "Built most of it with our own hands. When funding dried up, we taught kids how to make bricks. When the stove broke, she taught them how to build a fire. She was the heartbeat. I just followed along." His voice dipped lower. "She got sick in 2003. Stomach pain that wouldn't go away. Doctors in the city ran some tests. Turned out to be cancer. They think it was exposure. Something she touched, maybe. Something she inhaled years ago during fieldwork." Keanu's shoulders dropped slightly, his breath shallow. "What happened?" he asked gently. Frank's hands folded together. "She died in March of 2004. Frank didn't speak for a while after that. He rubbed his thumbs together, eyes locked on something invisible in the distance. Keanu didn't press. The silence felt heavier than words could carry. "I buried her under the banyan tree behind the shelter," Frank said finally. "Planted white orchids around the spot. She loved orchids. Said they were proof that something delicate could survive in rough places." Keanu looked toward the back of the shelter, where the outline of the tree stood tall in the moonlight. "I thought about leaving," Frank admitted. "A few people told me I should, that I'd done enough, that it was okay to move on, go home. But..." He trailed off, and Keanu waited. Frank sighed. "But every kid here knew her. They trusted her. They leaned on her. And I couldn't face the idea that one day they'd ask where she went. And I wouldn't be here to answer." Keanu swallowed. "So you stayed?" Frank nodded. "I stayed because she wouldn't have left them. And I couldn't either. Not after everything we built. Not after everything they lost." He wiped at his eyes with the back of his hand, embarrassed. "Damn dust in the air." Keanu didn't smile. He just nodded slowly. "Team sounds remarkable." "She was," Frank said. "Stronger than me, in every way. Smarter, too. I was just the hands. She was the reason." Keanu leaned back against a post, his chest tight with something he didn't quite have words for. This wasn't charity, it wasn't obligation, it was grief turned into legacy. It was love poured into bricks and bandages and mosquito nets. And it hadn't stopped, not even when she did. Frank picked up the cup of tea again but didn't drink. "I ain't special," he muttered. "I just didn't want to quit halfway." Keanu turned his head, watching him. "That's what makes it special." Frank looked away, the compliment too heavy to hold. "I've made plenty of mistakes, things I'd take back if I could, but staying was the one thing I got right." The wind picked up slightly, rustling the tarp overhead. Keanu whispered, "She'd be proud of that." Frank didn't reply, but the look in his eyes said everything. In the distance, the children shifted in their sleep, and somewhere under the banyan tree, white orchids stood blooming in the dark. The moon had risen higher now, casting silver light across the courtyard. The sounds of the village had quieted to nothing but insects and the occasional crack of bamboo cooling from the day's heat. Keanu and Frank sat in that stillness, the conversation still echoing in both of their chests. Keanu turned the cup in his hand slowly. "You know, most people don't live their lives this way." Frank let out a dry chuckle. "Good. The world would collapse if too many of us stopped paying taxes and started patching leaky roofs." Keanu shook his head. "I mean it. Most people don't build something like this out of grief. They run from it or freeze inside it. But you took it and turned it into something that breathes." Frank exhaled long and low. "It wasn't a plan. I didn't have a roadmap. I just woke up every morning and asked what needed doing. And if my back didn't hurt too bad, I did it." Keanu smiled faintly. "You make it sound so simple." "It isn't," Frank said. "It's messy. It's lonely. You give up more than you expect. But every time a child calls your name, every time a broken chair rolls straight for once, you remember what it's all for." He looked at Keanu with that same calm, unflinching gaze. "I didn't stay to be noble. I stayed because someone had to, and I was already here." Keanu nodded. "And the fact that you stayed, that's what makes this place sacred." Frank didn't respond right away. Then, quietly, he said, "Leon used to say that love is only real if it's practiced. Not promised, not preached, practiced." Keanu let the words settle. He thought of his own life, of sets and spotlights and scripts, of crowds cheering and then disappearing into silence. He'd played men like Frank in films, but never met one like him in life until now. Frank stood slowly, stretching his arms behind his back. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow's repair day, and I'm giving you the busted faucet." Keanu laughed. "That's the thanks I get for listening? It's the thanks you get for staying." Keanu watched him disappear into the dark, his steps slow but sure. He looked once more toward the banyan tree, its branches swaying slightly in the breeze. Then he whispered to no one in particular, "She was right to trust you." And somewhere in the quiet, Keanu knew. He hadn't just met a forgotten man. He'd met a man who remembered everything that mattered. Keanu didn't return to the shelter the next morning. Instead, he quietly checked into a modest hotel near the center of Da Nang. No red carpet, no VIP treatment. Just a clean room with a fan that hummed and a window that opened to the sound of motorbikes below. He sat at the edge of the bed, the weight of Frank's story still in his chest. He'd filmed dozens of moments now, some tender, some heartbreaking, but none of them felt finished. Telling Frank's story on camera wasn't enough. Not when the world moved too quickly to remember faces without fame. He picked up his phone and called Lynn. She arrived 30 minutes later, looking curious but unsurprised. Keanu poured her tea from the room's small kettle and motioned to the chair across from him. "I have an idea," he said. Lynn tilted her head. "This sounds dangerous already." Keanu smiled. I want to share Frank's story. Lynn paused, hands folded. He'll resist. I know, Keanu said. That's why I want to do it differently. Not a documentary, not a social media campaign, something real, something lasting. Lynn narrowed her eyes. Go on. I want to build a platform, one that honors people like Frank, forgotten veterans, quiet healers, those who stayed when it was easier to walk away. But more than that, I want it to support the people they protect, the ones still living in war's shadow. Lynn leaned forward, intrigued now. You mean like a foundation? Keanu nodded. Yes, but one that tells stories with purpose, that funds shelters, clinics, clean water projects, something cross-national. Something that reminds people the war didn't end when the guns stopped. She was quiet for a moment. You're serious? I've never been more. She studied him, weighing the look in his eyes. Frank won't take money. He doesn't accept donations. He sees it as pity. Then we won't call it that, Keanu said. We won't frame it as charity. We frame it as continuation. He didn't stop after the war. Why should the support? Lynn sat back slowly. You're not trying to save him. No, Keanu said. I'm trying to make sure he's not the last of his kind. That answer shifted something in the room. Lynn looked down at her hands. You really think people will care? Keanu met her gaze. They already do. They just haven't seen the right story yet. Lynn looked away for a moment, then nodded once. All right, she said. Then we make sure it's told the right way. They walked down the busy street later that day, weaving between scooters and shopkeepers setting up for the evening. Lynn led Keanu to a quiet cafe tucked behind an alley near the Han River, a place where the Wi-Fi was decent and the owner didn't care who you were as long as you ordered coffee. They took a seat in the corner. Lynn opened her laptop. Keanu pulled a notebook from his bag, its pages filled with scribbles, bullet points, and circles drawn in ink. I've been thinking about the name, he said. I want it to reflect what Frank's done, something that speaks to silence and what follows. Lynn tapped her pen. What about hope after silence? Keanu looked up. He didn't say anything for a second. Then softly, that's it. Lynn nodded. It doesn't mention war or veterans, but it carries the weight. It honors them without trapping them in a box, Keanu said. They outlined the basic plan, a small launch site with Frank's story told in video, photo, and words. A donation platform built around transparency, every dollar tracked, every dollar used locally. A long-term plan for grants, medical supply shipments, educational programs, and sustainable funding. Not charity. Legacy. Not for Frank, but through him. By the time the streetlights flickered on, Keanu had made a list of contacts, tech partners, nonprofit advisors, designers, and storytellers he trusted. Lynn closed her laptop. The only problem is still Frank. Keanu exhaled. Yeah, you'll need his blessing, she said. If you try to do it without him, he'll never trust you again. Keanu looked out the window. I'm not going to do it without him. Then you need to talk to him, Lynn said. Really talk. I will. She leaned back. And you need to understand, he won't say yes because of your name. He'll only say yes if he feels it's not about him. Keanu nodded. Then I'll make that clear. He stood, gripping the notebook a little tighter. I'm not going to make him a symbol, Keanu said. I'm going to show the world what it looks like when someone refuses to quit halfway. Lynn looked at him, something shifting in her expression. Respect. And something close to hope. I'll help you build it, she said, but only if you promise to keep it honest. Keanu extended his hand. I promise. They shook on it, no ceremony, just a quiet vow. In the corner of a quiet cafe, the seed of something bigger than either of them had started to take root. That night, Keanu didn't sleep. He sat at the small hotel desk, watching the footage again. Frank laughing as he patched a roof with two kids holding flashlights. Frank crouching beside Min, tying a splint made from bamboo and a rubber strap. Frank whispering something to a girl in a wheelchair that made her smile for the first time in days. Keanu paused the video. He opened his notebook again. At the top of a fresh page, he wrote, "We don't need to change the world. We need to remember the people who already are." The next morning, he made his way back to the shelter, camera bag over one shoulder and journal tucked beneath his arm. The sky was bright, humid. The air buzzed with the sounds of morning sweeping, roosters and pots clanging. Frank was already outside, fitting a wooden brace around a boy's ankle. He glanced up when he saw Keanu. "You look like a man with something to confess," he said. Keanu smiled. "Not confess. Ask." Frank stood, wiping his hands on his pants. "All right, shoot." Keanu took a breath. "I want to tell your story." Frank raised an eyebrow. "You've been doing that already?" "I want to do more," Keanu said. "With your permission, I want to build something that carries what you've done forward. A platform, a fund, something that can help this place long after we're gone." Frank narrowed his eyes. "I told you, I'm not interested in being anyone's poster boy." "You won't be," Keanu replied. "This isn't about turning you into a symbol. It's about making sure no one like you is forgotten again, and making sure these kids, this village, get what they need." Frank crossed his arms. "What's it called?" "Hope After Silence," Keanu said. Frank blinked. His mouth didn't move, but something in his eyes shifted. After a long pause, he said, "She used to say that." Keanu tilted his head. "Lean?" Frank nodded. "When the clinic first opened," she said, "hope doesn't shout. It whispers after the guns stop." Keanu said nothing. Frank looked down, rubbed his hands together, then finally looked back up. "You don't make it about me, you make it about them." "I swear," Keanu said. Frank nodded once. "Zen, I'll think about it." Keanu smiled. "That's all I ask." Frank turned back toward the boy on the bench. "Now help me with this splint. It's going to take more than words to hold this one together." Keanu stepped beside him, grabbing the roll of gauze without another word. Because legacy didn't start with promises. It started with showing up. The morning light filtered through the trees behind the shelter, soft and gold. Keanu arrived early, a small tablet tucked under his arm, his shoulders squared with quiet purpose. He found Frank in the courtyard, seated on an overturned bucket, sharpening a rusted garden spade with deliberate care. Frank looked up as Keanu approached. "Back already?" Keanu smiled. "I told you I wasn't finished." Frank stood slowly, wiping his hands on a rag. "You want to talk?" Keanu nodded. "I want to show you something first." Frank eyed the tablet in Keanu's hand, then gave a small sigh. "You been editing?" "Just a short cut," Keanu said. "No narration, no background music, just what I saw." Frank gave a slow nod. "All right." They moved inside the shelter, settling on two stools in the main room. Keanu placed the tablet between them and hit play. The screen flickered to life. It opened with a clip of Frank holding Min's hand as the boy tried to walk across the courtyard. The camera didn't zoom or shift. It stayed steady, quiet, letting the moment breathe. Then came Thu, the blind girl, giggling as Frank helped her stir a pot of rice. A quick cut showed him adjusting the old solar panel with Keanu behind him, laughing as it sparked to life. Another clip, Frank singing that lullaby in broken Vietnamese while bandaging a scraped knee. Then a shot of him fixing the roof, passing a hammer to one of the older boys like they'd done it 100 times before. All of it real, all of it unpolished. At the end, the screen faded to black. Then, one sentence appeared in white. "The man who stayed." Frank didn't move. His hands resting on his knees trembled slightly. Keanu didn't speak. When Frank finally broke the silence, his voice was hoarse. "Why are you doing this?" Keanu answered without hesitation. "Because the world forgot you, but I won't." Frank looked down, his jaw clenched. "You could have filmed anything, "I didn't come to film," Keanu said. "I came to understand." Frank rubbed at his eyes with the back of his hand. "I don't want pity, Keanu." "This isn't pity," Keanu said. "It's proof that people like you exist, that healing didn't stop when the war ended. It just moved into places no one was watching." Frank swallowed hard. "You make me a saint, I walk." "I won't," Keanu said. "I'll make you human." Frank turned back to the tablet, still shaking. "Then tell it right," he whispered. "Just tell them I showed up." Keanu nodded once, sealing the promise between them. Frank leaned back against the wall, the weight of the tablet's final image still lingering in his eyes. "You know, I never wanted to be remembered for this," he said. "I just didn't want to forget who I used to be." Keanu sat quietly beside him. "What do you mean?" As Frank tilted his head slightly. "Before all this? The shelter? The kids? I wasn't much. When I first came back to Vietnam, I was still half a ghost. Couldn't sleep, couldn't talk to people. Just walked from job to job trying not to fall apart. But when those kids started needing help, when they looked at me like I was someone who could fix things, I became that person for them. Day by day," Keanu stared at him. "You became the man they needed." Frank shook his head. "I became the man I needed." The words struck Keanu deeper than he expected. Frank looked over. "You understand that, don't you?" Keanu hesitated, then nodded. "More than you know." There was a pause, soft and open. Frank picked up the tablet again, flipping back through the video clips, slowly. He stopped on one of him brushing a girl's hair. Her spine curved awkwardly as she leaned into his hand. "Deem used to scream anytime someone touched her," he said. "Took her 6 months before she let me near her shoulder. Now she asks me to help braid her hair." He chuckled lightly. "I'm not good at it." Keanu smiled. "Doesn't matter, she trusts you." Frank looked up. "That's why this matters, Keanu. Not the footage. The trust. If people see this and decide to come help for the right reasons, to show up and stay, then okay. You have my blessing." Keanu sat up straighter. "Really? But no spotlight tours, no news vans, no social media influencers with selfie sticks," Frank added. "If they come to serve." Keanu nodded. "They'll know the rules." Frank gave him a long look, then exhaled. "Then you tell it. You tell it with the dirt and the laughter and the sore backs. No soft lighting, no savior music. You have my word," Keanu said. Frank looked back to the tablet one last time. "The man who stayed," he read aloud, almost to himself. "Not bad." He closed the tablet and handed it back. "Now let's get back to work. The wheelchair's busted again, and these kids don't care about legacy. They care about moving." Keanu stood with him. "Then let's move." The morning rolled forward with quiet momentum. Keanu and Frank worked side by side, tightening the axle on the broken wheelchair, adjusting the worn footrests, and replacing a cracked handle. The courtyard buzzed with life again. Kids sweeping, others practicing words on a chalkboard. One of the boys humming the same lullaby Frank used to sing. Frank didn't say much as they worked, but his movements had changed. Lighter somehow, less guarded. Keanu felt it too. Permission hadn't just been given, it had been earned. Lynn arrived mid-morning, her expression sharp and curious. Keanu gave her a small nod, then turned to Frank. "She's in this too, full partner." Frank looked Lynn over. "She's the one who keeps this running half the time. Of course she is." Lynn grinned. "I'll take that as the highest praise." They gathered under the shade as Frank sipped water from a tin cup. "So, what's next?" Keanu glanced at Lynn, then back at Frank. "Next, we build it. Quietly, respectfully. And when it's ready, we let the story speak for itself." Frank gave a slow nod. "And if people don't care?" Keanu looked him in the eye. "Then they weren't meant to. But the ones who do, those are the ones who will make it matter." Frank grunted. "All right. Just don't let them paint murals of me again. I don't like looking at my own nose 10 feet tall." Lynn laughed. "No promises." They stood there together for a few more minutes, just listening to the shelter buzz around them. No speeches, no ceremony. Just a beginning, quiet as the work that had come before it. Frank finished his water and set the cup down. "Well, I've got laundry to scrub. If I don't get to it, the kids will be wearing towels tomorrow." He turned to walk back toward the wash basin, then stopped and looked back at Keanu. "You know what the hardest part of staying was?" Keanu shook his head. "Believing it would matter, even if no one ever found out?" He tapped his chest once. "Now someone has. That's enough." Keanu nodded. "I'll make sure it doesn't stop with you." Frank smirked. "It never started with me. Just make sure it keeps going." As Frank walked away, Keanu stood still, watching the old man disappear behind the wall of swaying laundry lines. The video had begun as a story about a medic, but now it was something more, a torch being passed, not into fame, but into faith. It was just after midnight when Keanu sat down to upload the video. He was alone in the small hotel room again. The only light came from the screen of his laptop, casting a pale glow across the desk. The air was still, the city outside silent. But Keanu's mind was alive with purpose. He clicked open the folder labeled Frank Final Cut. Inside was the 2-minute video he and Lynn had edited together over the past 48 hours. No narration, no camera tricks, just real moments. Laughter, struggle, small victories. A man who had stayed. Keanu reviewed the final version one last time. Clip 1. Frank placing a pair of new shoes on Min's crooked feet, smiling like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. Clip 2. A quiet frame of Frank kneeling by the banyan tree, orchids blooming softly behind him. Clip 3. Frank holding a blind girl's hand as she traced the letters of her name across a piece of paper. Then the final screen. White text on black. One man, one village, one promise that never ended. Beneath it, a message written in both English and Vietnamese. This story isn't about war. It's about what comes after. The wounds that don't heal in hospitals. The ones carried in silence. If you believe in showing up and staying, help us carry this promise forward. Then came the link. A simple page, hosted on a secure charity storytelling platform. No Keanu branding, no reference to his identity. Just the story of a man named Frank Dawson and a vision for something called Hope After Silence. Keanu took a deep breath and clicked Publish. The screen refreshed. The story was live. At first, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the view count ticked upward. 100, then 400. At the 30-minute mark, Lynn texted, "Already past 1,000. An hour later, it hit 5,000. By sunrise, it was 26,000 and climbing. Keanu leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. He wasn't exhausted. He was overwhelmed. Not by the numbers, but by the fact that people were seeing it, really seeing it. The comments began pouring in. I served in Vietnam. I've never seen someone capture the quiet side of what came after. Thank you. My grandfather was a medic. He never talked about it. I wish he could see this. This made me cry. I want to help. Please tell me how. I don't know who filmed this, but they saw something holy. The first donation came in from a woman in Oregon, $25. Then a man in Seoul, $50. Then a retired veteran in Texas, $200, with the message, for the man who stayed when the rest of us came home. Keanu stared at the screen. The world was watching, and the story was finally speaking. By midday, the video had crossed 200,000 views. Men called from the shelter, with a tone Keanu hadn't heard from her before. Part disbelief, part joy, and part awe. "You need to see what's happening," she said. "It's everywhere." Keanu refreshed the page. Comments were flooding in faster than he could read. People from Australia, Canada, the Philippines, former soldiers, teachers, mothers, people who had no connection to Vietnam, yet were moved by the sight of a man who simply chose not to leave. One comment read, "We talk about heroes like they wear medals. This one wears dust and still shows up every day." Another, "I've seen thousands of videos online, but this one made me stop, cry, and donate." And another, "Why did no one know about him until now? How many others like him are out there?" The donations passed $50,000, 0 cents, by the early afternoon. Small gifts, big ones, anonymous ones. People weren't just giving, they were sharing the story. Celebrities reposted it without tagging Keanu. Veteran groups reposted it with hashtags like "The Man Who Stayed" and "Hope After Silence." A well-known journalist tweeted, "Whoever made this, thank you. You've reminded us what quiet greatness looks like." Still, Keanu didn't speak publicly. He didn't step forward, because this wasn't about him. This was about Frank. Lynn updated the donation page with a live tracker, each milestone unlocking a new project. The first $20,000, 0 cents, was already earmarked to reinforce the shelter's foundation and buy new medical equipment. The next goal would fund a full-time nurse, the first paid staff Frank had ever allowed. And then something unexpected happened. Dozens of people wrote asking to visit, not as tourists, not as journalists, as volunteers, nurses, engineers, language teachers, even a retired Navy mechanic who said he still had enough in his hands to fix whatever wheels were left. Keanu read every message. Each one was another thread pulling Frank's story out of the corner it had been buried in and weaving it into something bigger than any of them had imagined. Frank didn't ask for any of it, but for the first time in years, the world came to him, not with noise, with purpose. Later that day, a well-known human rights foundation reached out to Lynn, offering logistical support and legal assistance to help Hope After Silence register internationally. The story was no longer just a post online. It was a movement, and it had begun with a quiet man in a quiet village, one who never asked to be seen. But finally, people were looking. That evening, Keanu returned to the shelter. He didn't announce anything, he just showed up with his sleeves rolled up and a bag of supplies over one shoulder. The children greeted him like they always did, with shy smiles, open arms, and not a single mention of the video. To them, he was still just the quiet man who helped patch the roof and serve lunch. Frank sat on a stool near the water barrels, rubbing ointment into a boy's shoulders. "You post it?" he asked, not looking up. Keanu nodded. Frank nodded slowly. "Figured. Place has been humming like a hornet's nest all day." Keanu sat beside him. "Donations are pouring in. Lynn's already got contractors lined up to fix the plumbing and electrical. The medical team she's working with thinks they can start a rotation within a month." Frank didn't say anything for a moment. Then, I spent years wondering if all this would just die with me, like I'd vanish and the kids would scatter and the buildings would crumble. Keanu looked at him. "That's not going to happen." Frank's hands paused. He looked up, his voice rough. "Because you showed it." "No," Keanu said. "Because you lived it." Frank chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You made me look better than I am." "I showed you as you are," Keanu replied. That was enough. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the courtyard. Keanu stood and helped carry 2 buckets of clean water toward the kitchen, the children trailing behind him with plastic cups and mismatched bowls. He wasn't thinking about the comments anymore, or the viral shares, or the money. He was thinking about how quiet Frank's footsteps were, and how far they had carried him. As they finished the last of the evening chores, a girl handed Frank a drawing, crayon on scrap paper. It showed a stick figure with a crooked back and a wide smile, standing next to children holding stars. Above it, written in careful block letters, "Con Frank Diorqua." Frank looked down at the paper, eyes misting. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Keanu stood nearby, watching the moment, the corners of his mouth lifting with quiet reverence. The story had gone live, but the truth had always been alive. Now, it would keep living. Not because the world had finally paid attention, but because one man had refused to stop showing up, even when no one else had. 7 days after the video went live, the donation total passed $1,200,000, 0 cents. The number sat on the homepage of the campaign like a quiet exhale. No flashing banners, no dramatic announcements, just a line that read, "Together we're building what war tried to erase." Keanu stood on the rooftop of the shelter, watching workers begin to unload supplies from a flatbed truck below. New medical beds, UV filtration systems, pallets of insulation for the roof. It was happening faster than he imagined, but slower than what the children had already endured. Frank stood beside him, arms crossed, silent. "They don't just give money," Keanu said. "They gave faith." Frank didn't speak for a moment. Then he nodded toward the crates. "I'm letting them install the equipment. Doesn't mean I'm giving up my toolbox." Keanu smiled. "Wouldn't dream of it." Down below, Lynn waved toward them, clipboard in hand, already directing where each shipment needed to go. She'd hired 3 new local contractors who had experience with mobile clinic builds. A team from Hanoi was on the way to consult on turning the unused storage room into a clean medical bay. But that was only the beginning. With guidance from international partners, Keanu began coordinating the formation of a binational medical outreach initiative. It would be headquartered in Da Nang, but operate across 3 provinces with the highest levels of Agent Orange impact. The plan included mobile clinics, transportation support, housing rehabilitation for families of disabled children, and long-term care facilities built in stages. Frank read the proposal twice, then handed it back. "It's good," he said, "as long as it doesn't have my name on it." Keanu nodded. "It won't." Frank raised an eyebrow. "You sure? That's usually how these things go. One man makes noise and suddenly his name's on buildings." Keanu shook his head. "I've already named it." Frank waited. Keanu looked out across the rice fields, the horizon wide and quiet. "It's called Hope After Silence," he said. Frank's expression didn't change right away. Then, slowly, he looked down at his hands. After a long pause, he whispered, "Lean would have liked that." Keanu nodded. "I know." Frank cleared his throat and blinked quickly. "All right then. Just don't expect me to wear a suit when you open it." "I won't," Keanu said, "but maybe just a clean shirt." They both laughed, and the weight between them lightened for a moment. Down below, children ran between stacks of boxes, their laughter echoing through the open courtyard. The work was just beginning. But for the first time, they weren't building alone. In the days that followed, the courtyard turned into a symphony of hammering, drilling, and excited chatter. Children peeked into rooms being gutted and transformed. New tiles replaced cracked concrete. Lynn's team converted one entire wing into a full-time pediatric recovery center. A quiet volunteer from the United States arrived, an orthopedic nurse fluent in Vietnamese. She was the first of many. Everywhere Keanu looked, someone was helping. But the most surprising name to show up wasn't on a visitor list. It came through a secure message to Lynn's inbox. The name was Riley Ward. Keanu saw it the moment Lynn opened the email beside him in the cafe. "She said she's not here to be seen," Lynn explained. "But she read the article, watched the video, said she wanted to help from behind the curtain." Keanu stared at the message, It was brief, direct, but underneath it was the same quiet force he remembered from their years working together. Riley had attached a strategic logistics plan, one designed for rapid response care deployment in remote areas. She included contacts for mobile equipment suppliers, former field medics in Asia, and a Vietnamese-American liaison from her days in intelligence. She signed the message with just 2 words: "If it helps." Keanu smiled. Of course, she didn't need to say more. He replied that same evening. 3 days later, crates of modular medical tents arrived from Bangkok. Riley had coordinated the entire shipment through a friend in humanitarian logistics. She never called, never followed up, but she kept sending resources. Lynn smirked. "She's as stubborn as Frank," Keanu replied. That's probably why they'd never survive in the same room. By the end of the week, the new Hope After Silence network had hired 4 Vietnamese nurses, 2 drivers for mobile clinics, and a small administration team to handle documentation and translation. None of the staff were outsiders to the mission. Every person brought on had ties to the communities affected, either through family or service. And though Frank never stood on a podium or cut a ribbon, he walked the halls every morning before the workers arrived. He checked every mattress, repaired every door hinge, smiled at every child. When Lynn handed him a folder with the official registration of Hope After Silence as a non-profit cooperative between Vietnam and international donors, he said only one thing: "Keep it out of politics." Lynn nodded. "Just medicine, just healing." Frank looked at Keanu. "And when it gets messy?" Keanu answered without hesitation. "We stay." Frank didn't say anything after that, but his shoulders eased, just enough to mean something. By the second Saturday, the first mobile clinic rolled out of the shelter's gates. It wasn't flashy, just a clean white van with the Hope After Silence emblem stenciled on the door, a single orchid blooming from a cracked stone. Frank stood beside it with arms folded, watching 2 young nurses load supplies into the back. The van would travel to 3 neighboring villages over the weekend, offering health checkups, wound care, vaccinations, and physical therapy consultations. Keanu stood nearby, watching as Lynn gave the final checklist to the driver. "This is because of you," she said quietly. Keanu shook his head. "It's because of Frank." Frank, hearing his name, turned and rolled his eyes. "You 2 are giving me a headache." Keanu grinned. "That's the price of legacy." Frank didn't answer, but there was a smirk buried in the corner of his mouth. That afternoon, Lynn organized a community meeting in the shelter courtyard. Dozens of families came, some from 2 towns away. Keanu stayed in the back, blending in, just listening. A mother stood and spoke through tears about her son, born with fused fingers and weak lungs. She had lost hope of ever affording treatment. Now, she had a number to call, a nurse to visit, a place that would follow through. Others shared stories, some bitter, some grateful, all true. Hope After Silence wasn't just helping. It was reminding people they weren't forgotten. After the meeting, Keanu found Frank seated beneath the banyan tree, peeling a mango with a pocket knife. "You didn't speak," Keanu said. Frank shrugged. "Didn't need to. They did fine without me." Keanu sat beside him. Frank handed him a mango slice. "Still can't believe this is happening." Keanu looked around at the children playing in the courtyard, the volunteers cleaning the kitchen, the shelter buzzing with new life. "It didn't start today," Keanu said. "It started the day you stayed." Frank looked down at the dirt. "I don't know what this will become," Keanu added, "but I know it'll carry your fingerprints for a long time." Frank nodded slowly. "Just make sure the roof holds." Keanu smiled. "I'll call the contractors myself." They sat there for a long time, the mango gone, the sun setting behind the fields. The laughter of children rolled through the air like a hymn. For the first time in 4 decades, the shelter wasn't a secret. And Frank Dawson wasn't a mystery. He was a man who stayed, who showed up when others left, who turned silence into healing. And because of that, a movement had begun, not in his name, but in his spirit. By the second month, the shelter no longer looked like a place forgotten by time. The roof had been reinforced with steel brackets. A fresh coat of pale blue paint covered the outer walls. The courtyard had been swept clean, lined with flowering plants that Lynn said were easy to maintain. The kitchen had new tiles, a new gas range, and stainless steel counters. A row of solar panels now sat angled on the roof, catching sunlight like quiet guardians of progress. But none of that made Frank smile, the way the three kids inside did. They weren't children exactly. Two were young men, barely 20. One was a young woman named Mai, just shy of her final year in university. All three had applied to help with Hope After Silence through Lynn's outreach campaign. And Frank had picked them himself. He was teaching them everything. How to clean wounds with respect, not pity. How to change a tire on the mobile clinic van. How to bandage a burn without making the patient flinch. How to listen. And every Wednesday evening, under the soft glow of a hanging bulb, Frank sat with them on the steps outside the shelter and taught them guitar. His old instrument had been restrung, its wood still scarred from years of humidity and use. The kids called him Ong Frank, Grandpa Frank. At first, he corrected them. Now he just smiled and answered to it. When Keanu returned after a few weeks on set, he arrived unannounced and unrecognized, walking up the same dusty path he had taken on the first rainy day. But this time, the sounds of laughter reached him before the shelter even came into view. He found Frank sitting on a stool, watching the three volunteers assemble a ramp on the western side of the shelter for easier wheelchair access. He didn't look surprised to see Keanu. "Took you long enough," Frank said. Keanu glanced around. "Place looks different." Frank nodded. "Feels different too." They stood in silence for a moment, surveying the courtyard. New beds, new tools, new energy, but the same spirit. "You gave me backup," Frank said. Keanu turned toward him. Frank continued. "Took me 40 years, but I finally got a team." Keanu smiled. "Looks like they're learning from the best." Frank shook his head. "They're learning from experience. I just make sure they don't trip over the broom handle." One of the young men called out for Frank's opinion on the angle of the ramp. Frank walked over without hesitation, crouched beside him, and gently corrected the level. Then he turned and shouted, "Get me the wrench, not the one that slips." The young man ran off to find it. Frank stood slowly and looked back at Keanu. "I'm not leaving anytime soon." Keanu nodded. "Didn't think you would." Keanu followed Frank back into the shelter, passing under the now brightly painted doorway, where a hand-carved sign read, "Hope After Silence, Welcome Home." It hadn't been part of the original design. Mai had carved it herself, with help from two of the children who insisted that the words needed to be permanent. Inside, the space felt transformed. A new storeroom was stocked with sealed containers of gauze, gloves, and vitamins. Clean linens filled a shelf near the door. A map on the wall showed planned routes for mobile clinic visits over the next 3 months. Red dots marked villages that had never had consistent medical access before. Frank walked Keanu through it like a proud but reserved host, waving off praise each time Keanu commented on the upgrades. "You should see what these kids do when I get out of their way," he said. "I come back and the place is cleaner than a hospital." They stepped into one of the rooms that had once been dim and humid. It now had a small air conditioning unit and bright natural light. Two children slept peacefully on narrow cots, breathing easier. Keanu's voice dropped to a whisper. "You're changing their futures." Frank looked at the children for a long moment, then said quietly, "I'm just giving them what we never got after the war. Continuity. Someone who sticks." In the classroom space, Mai was teaching one of the older kids how to use a digital thermometer. Frank watched from the doorway, arms crossed. "I used to be the one explaining all that," he said. "Now they do it better than I ever could." Keanu smiled. That's what leadership is." Frank didn't answer, but the corners of his mouth twitched. Later, they sat beneath the tree where Frank and Lean had once planned the shelter's first expansion. The orchids were in bloom. The shade stretched wide. "I didn't think I'd ever get to this part," Frank said. "What part?" Keanu asked. "The part where I could pass something down. I figured I'd work until I dropped and hope someone buried me near her." Keanu said nothing. Frank looked toward the volunteers unloading water filters from a truck. "But now I've got hands, real ones, smart ones, committed." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "That's my new mission, not to keep doing the same thing forever, but to teach them how to do it better." Keanu nodded. "You're building more than a shelter now. You're building people." Frank glanced sideways. "Don't say that out loud, you'll ruin my reputation." Keanu chuckled. "Too late. They already call you Frank." Frank shook his head, but he didn't stop smiling. That evening, as dusk crept in and the first stars appeared over the rice fields, Keanu walked the grounds with Frank one last time before heading back to the city. The shelter was quiet. Children were already asleep. The hum of the solar generator buzzed softly in the background. They stopped near the tool shed. A soft glow spilled out from the open door where the 3 volunteers sat, sharing a late bowl of soup and quietly laughing about something Frank had said earlier. One of them picked up the old guitar and strummed a few chords, badly. The others groaned. Frank shook his head. "I'm still working on that part." Keanu smiled. "You've got time." They sat on the steps, the same ones where Keanu had first watched Frank bandage a child's foot months ago. Frank looked out toward the darkened path leading back to the main road. "You know," he said, "for a long time, I thought this would all die with me. I thought I was holding it together with duct tape and prayer." Keanu didn't interrupt. Frank continued. "But now, when I watch them, not vous, I realize it doesn't need me forever. That's the whole point." Keanu nodded slowly. "You're not holding it together anymore. You're passing it forward." Frank leaned back, gazing at the stars. "I never wanted a legacy. Just wanted to keep the lights on, keep the kids fed. Turns out when you do that long enough, legacy builds itself." Keanu looked over at him. "And it's the strongest kind. The kind made of habits, not headlines." Frank gave a slow exhale. "You gave me something I didn't think I'd ever have." Keanu waited. Frank said it softly. "Relief, not retirement. Just the feeling that it's okay to rest sometimes, that someone else is watching the gate." Keanu nodded, a lump catching in his throat. Frank stood and stretched, his joints cracking in the quiet. "You're coming back, right?" he asked without looking. Keanu smiled. "You won't be able to get rid of me." Frank grunted, satisfied. "Good. We'll need you for ramp inspections. The new ones are crooked." Keanu laughed. "I'll bring a level." Frank turned to head inside, pausing once. "You know what they called me when I first got here in the 80s? He asked. Keanu shook his head. "Crazy white man with a death wish." "And now?" Frank smirked. "Now they call me Frank." He walked inside, his silhouette framed by the light of a place that once barely stood, and now stood tall, because he stayed. The hotel room in Da Nang was quiet. Keanu sat at the desk near the window, where the early evening breeze stirred the curtain and carried in the scent of rain. His journal lay open, a clean sheet of paper resting on top. He picked up the pen slowly, thoughtfully, and after a pause, began to write. "Dear Dad, I don't know why it's taken me this long to write to you. Maybe because for most of my life, I didn't know what to say. Maybe because the silence between us always felt too wide to cross. But something changed. I met a man here. His name is Frank Dawson. He was a combat medic, just like you. Served in Vietnam, but unlike you, he never left. He stayed. He stayed long after the bullets stopped. Long after the uniforms were folded. While most people went home, he stayed and built a life inside the broken pieces, not for himself, but for the people the war had forgotten. He didn't get a medal, he didn't ask for one. What he got was 30 years of scraped hands, sleepless nights, sick children, and broken roofs. He didn't speak about heroism. He just woke up every day and did the next thing that needed doing. Keanu paused, staring at the words. He thought of his father's weathered face, the anger that sometimes surfaced for no reason, the heaviness he carried and never shared. You came home, Dad, but I'm not sure you ever made it all the way back. I used to think that was your fault, that you abandoned us, that you gave up. But now, I see things differently. Maybe you were still at war, even when you were sitting at the kitchen table. Frank made me think of you, not in the way he talks, but in the way he doesn't. The way he carries things silently, the way he works until his hands are raw and still says it's nothing. You were like that too, weren't you? You just didn't have a place to put it. He found his. Maybe that's the difference. Frank didn't come here with a plan. He came with regret, guilt, and something he didn't know how to name at the time. But instead of drinking it down or burying it in silence, he turned it into service. He started helping children. He rebuilt a shelter. He patched wounds no one else wanted to touch. And he never stopped. He stayed when the money ran out. He stayed when storms ripped the roof off. He stayed when the children screamed from fevers that had no names. He stayed when no one else did. No cameras, no headlines. Just him and a promise he made to a woman he loved. Her name was Leon. She was a nurse. She died from cancer in 2004. He buried her under the tree behind the shelter. He told me he almost left then, but he didn't. Because the children remembered her, and he couldn't bear to let them lose both of them. Keanu looked up from the paper. He could hear the sounds of the city again. Motorbikes, vendors, a dog barking in the alley. Life moving forward, always. He picked up the pen again. You once told me that war teaches you how to survive, but not how to come back. I didn't understand what you meant. I was too young. But now, watching Frank, I see it. You came back to a world that didn't have a place for your pain. And maybe that's what turned your silence into distance. Maybe that's why you pulled away. Because you didn't know how to explain a story no one wanted to hear. Frank didn't explain his pain either, but he gave it purpose. He let it live in the hands that cooked for children, in the voice that comforted the dying, in the sweat that kept a broken building standing. He never stopped being a soldier, he just changed battlefields. And maybe peace, real peace, isn't something that arrives with a treaty. Maybe it's something you have to build with your bare hands, one roof at a time, one bowl of soup, one child held through the night. I think you would have respected him, Dad, I really do. Because under everything, under the stubbornness and silence, I think you cared more than you could say. And Frank is the kind of man who makes silence feel full, not empty. He doesn't preach, he doesn't pretend to have the answers, but he shows up every day for the kids, for the broken ones, for the ones who never got another chance. He shows up for them the way I think you once wanted to show up for me. And here's the truth I didn't expect to write. I forgive you. Not because you earned it, not because time healed it, but because seeing Frank taught me something I'd never understood before. Some men fight the war, others finish it. You fought it, Dad. Frank stayed and finished it. You couldn't find your peace, but maybe part of me just did. Because I saw what it looks like when a man refuses to quit, even after the world forgets him. I saw what it looks like when someone turns pain into purpose. And it changed me. Keanu set the pen down. He folded the letter gently, smoothing the creases as if it might someday be opened by hands no longer here. There was no address to send it to. But that wasn't the point. The letter wasn't for the past. It was for the bridge between who his father had been and the man Keanu had just met. Frank had shown him something no movie ever could: the quiet weight of legacy, the dignity in staying, the power in choosing to begin again and again where others chose to end. Keanu slipped the letter into the back of his journal, tucked between pages filled with sketches and journal entries, all written during the weeks in Da Nang. He stood by the window. Outside, the lights of the city flickered, and in the distance, somewhere beyond the trees and rooftops, he knew Frank was still awake, doing what he'd always done, staying. The first headline came from a small online news outlet in California. A forgotten medic in Vietnam is changing lives in silence. Within 12 hours, it had been reprinted across 5 veteran forums and shared nearly 20,000 times. Then came a human interest piece from a national paper. The man who stayed, Frank Dawson's 40-year mission of quiet service. By the end of the week, the story had reached every major media outlet in the United States. Television producers asked for interviews. Keanu turned them down. He didn't want the attention, didn't want the spotlight to shift. But after a call from a congressional committee asking if he would lend his voice to a bipartisan policy roundtable, he agreed, on one condition. He would speak only about post-war medical support, international cooperation, and the creation of hope after silence. Mission, not himself, not his role, just the mission. The panel aired quietly, late one evening, without fanfare. But within days, letters poured in from veterans' families, nonprofit leaders, and Vietnamese American community organizers. Several lawmakers from both parties pledged new support for post-war aid reform and extended care funding for those left behind, both abroad and at home. At the center of it all was Frank's story, but not the Hollywood version, not the oversimplified arc of redemption or sacrifice. This story was different. It was about presence, not performance, about the days no one sees, and the hearts that never stop giving. Hope After Silence released a public report outlining the use of funds. It detailed new partnerships with medical schools in Hanoi, mobile mental health clinics, and scholarships for Vietnamese youth interested in rural healthcare work. Every section was grounded in transparency, and every paragraph circled back to one thing: Frank Dawson's legacy. Still, Frank hadn't changed much. He still woke up early, still walked the halls before the staff arrived, still scolded volunteers when they forgot to lock the tool shed. But one day, something happened that he couldn't deflect with a shrug. A group of school children from a nearby village had been following the story. Their teacher had shown them the original video during a class about international friendship. They decided to paint a mural. With permission from the school and a local artist, they covered the side of their classroom building with a sprawling portrait. Frank, kneeling beside a wheelchair-bound boy, holding a small bowl of soup. Around him were children laughing, playing, reaching toward the sky. Above the image, in both English and Vietnamese, were the words, "A true hero stays." When Frank saw it for the first time, he stood still for several minutes. He didn't speak. He didn't move. Then, without a word, he walked over and placed his palm lightly against the image. His fingers trembled, but his eyes were steady. Lynn took a photo of Frank standing before the mural. She sent it to Keanu with a single caption: "The world sees him now." Keanu didn't post it. He didn't share it. He saved it to his phone and looked at it every night before sleep. It wasn't just an image. It was a testament, the kind the world rarely gets to witness in real time. Not long after, a package arrived at the shelter. Inside was a framed letter, handwritten in careful script. It came from a former Marine in his 70s, now living in Arizona. The letter read, "I don't know you, Frank, but I've carried the same ghosts. You turned yours into light. I never got the chance to do that. But thanks to you, I'm starting to believe it's not too late." More letters followed, some typed, some handwritten, some in Vietnamese, others in English, a few in both. Children sent drawings, grandparents sent prayers. One woman sent a check with a note. "I've never donated to anything in my life, you change that." Frank didn't respond to any of them directly, but he kept every letter. Lynn found him one night rereading them in the kitchen by lamplight. When she asked if he needed anything, he said only, "Just making sure I didn't imagine it." The shelter buzzed more than ever now, not with noise, but with movement. Hope After Silence had hired 5 new local staff, expanded to 2 neighboring provinces, and begun restoring a rural clinic that had sat abandoned for more than a decade. Frank still refused any title. He insisted the volunteers call him Ong Frank and nothing more. When asked if he would approve a bronze plaque at the shelter entrance in his honor, he replied, "The only plaque I want is the one on the first kid's diploma." And then, in early spring, Keanu returned. He came quietly, as always. This time, he brought a small wooden box. Inside it was a certificate, a symbolic recognition from a coalition of international nonprofits for humanitarian service beyond borders. No cameras, no speeches, just a quiet presentation beneath the banyan tree, with the children seated on woven mats, watching. Frank looked at the box, then looked at Keanu. He didn't open it. He just said, "Let's go fix the faucet in the back." And Keanu followed, because in a world full of noise, Frank Dawson had reminded them all of something the world had almost forgotten. A hero isn't the man who arrives with fanfare. A hero is the one who never left. Keanu didn't tell anyone he was coming. He arrived in Da Nang just after sunrise. The rain had passed during the night, leaving the streets damp and quiet. He asked the driver to drop him off a few blocks from the shelter. He wanted to walk the last stretch. The air smelled like wet soil and jasmine. Everything felt still. But inside, Keanu could feel something shifting again. The road to the shelter was familiar now. The rust-colored wall, the rustle of banana leaves overhead, the echo of roosters from the far side of the field. It didn't feel like returning to a place he had visited. It felt like returning to a place that had changed him. At the gate, he paused. A group of children ran past him, barefoot and laughing, one of them waving a spoon like a sword. A volunteer jogged after them, out of breath but smiling. The rhythm of the place hadn't slowed. He stepped into the courtyard and found Frank exactly where he thought he'd be, under the banyan tree, sipping tea from a tin cup. Frank looked up and squinted. "Well, I'll be. You again." Keanu nodded. "Told you I wasn't done." Frank grunted. "Hope you brought gloves. The generator's making that noise again." Keanu walked over and took a seat beside him on the low stone bench. They sat in silence for a while, just watching the courtyard come to life. A girl swept the walkway. A nurse unboxed clean bandages and sorted them in a drawer. Mai passed by with a clipboard, gave them both a quick wave, and kept walking. Keanu pulled a thermos from his bag and poured them both a fresh cup of tea. He handed one to Frank. They didn't toast, didn't speak, just drank, the steam curling up between them like smoke from an old fire. Frank broke the silence first. "Thanks for not turning me into a movie." Keanu smiled, eyes still on the courtyard. "You already were one." Frank laughed once, dry and amused. "Yeah? Hope it was slow-paced. A lot of silence." It was honest. They sipped again. Another breeze passed through the branches. It felt like the kind of goodbye that didn't need words. After a few more quiet minutes, Keanu stood and stretched. "I fly out tonight." Frank didn't respond right away. He leaned back and looked toward the sky, where the clouds were parting to let in the late morning sun. "You'll be back," he said, as if it were already decided. Keanu nodded. "You know I will." Frank glanced at him and gave a small smile. "Good. I've got 2 more kids who want to learn guitar and one who keeps putting the wheelchair brake on backward. I could use a hand." I'm not going far. Frank took another sip of tea and waved him off, like a man who knew better than to say thank you when everything that mattered had already been said. Keanu walked the path alone. He took his time, pausing to watch a boy fix a broom handle, a girl water the flowers near the gate. Every small task felt sacred now, each one stitched into a much larger story that most people would never fully understand. And that was okay. As he reached the edge of the village, something caught his eye. The old roadside café where it all began was still there. The same uneven stools, the same smell of strong coffee and boiled rice. But above the entrance now hung a sign. It wasn't flashy, just a plank of smooth wood, hand-painted with steady care. It read, "Hope after silence begins here." Beneath the English was a second line in Vietnamese. Noi vong sao im lang bat dao. Keanu stood still. The wind moved gently through the open windows of the cafe. Someone inside was laughing. The scent of ginger and tea drifted out onto the path. The world, for all its noise and weight, had made room for something gentle, something lasting. He stepped inside and sat at the same table where he once waited out a storm. The table where he had first seen Frank helping that boy, unaware that a new story had just begun. This time, when the tea arrived, he didn't sip it quickly. He let it sit for a moment. Let the moment sit with him. Keanu looked around the cafe. On one wall, there was a new bulletin board with community flyers. Notes in Vietnamese and English pinned beside each other. Clinic schedules, literacy workshops, a drawing class for children. At the center of the board was a photo, framed in simple wood. It was Frank, seated beneath the banyan tree. Two children leaned into him, one laughing so hard their eyes had shut. The photo wasn't posed. Someone had captured it in motion. Below it was a quote, handwritten and uneven, but clear. The headline stayed to be seen, but the world saw him anyway. Keanu read the words again and again. He didn't need to take a picture. He didn't need to share it. Some moments weren't made to go viral. Some were made to be remembered. He finished his tea and stood. Outside, the path back to the main road was already warming under the sun. A group of young volunteers passed by, wheeling a cart filled with supplies. One of them wore a shirt with the Hope After Silence logo on the back, already faded from wear. They didn't recognize him. They didn't stop to ask for a photo. And that was exactly right. Keanu stepped out into the light. The wind tugged gently at his collar. The village moved at its own rhythm, slower, deliberate, enduring. It was a rhythm built not on spectacle, but on presence, on showing up, on staying, even when no one was watching. He thought again of Frank, still under that tree, probably fussing over a leaky faucet or reminding someone not to overcook the rice. Still doing the work, still holding the promise. Keanu took one last look at the sign above the cafe, then turned away. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He carried the story now, not as a project, not as a cause, but as something sacred, something he could protect by remembering, by showing up in other ways wherever he went next. And that was the truth Frank had always known. Sometimes, the most powerful thing a person can do is stay. The sun had just begun to set over the fields behind the shelter, casting long shadows through the rice paddies. The air was warm but calm, the kind of calm that doesn't ask for attention, just acceptance. Keanu walked alone. He had followed the narrow dirt path out of the compound, away from the sound of tools, footsteps, and laughter. He needed this distance, not because he wanted to leave, but because he wanted to understand the space between everything that had happened here and everything still to come. The fields were golden now. In the wind they moved like water, like a sea remembering how to breathe. In the distance, he could see the edge of the village where the first children Frank helped still lived, now grown, some with children of their own. Keanu stepped carefully, his boots brushing against the damp earth. He carried his journal under one arm and, in his other hand, a pen. He hadn't planned to write anything. But something about the light, the quiet, and the pull of memory made silence feel too heavy to carry back. He found a flat rock at the edge of the path and sat. From here, he could see it all. The village, the shelter, the tree where Frank always sat, the rooftop where volunteers now installed solar panels, the road where the mobile clinic would soon begin its second route. It didn't look like a monument. It looked like a beginning. Keanu opened the journal to a blank page. For a while, he just sat with it, letting the wind move across his shoulders. Then he wrote, "Peace isn't forgetting, it's remembering the right way." He stared at the sentence. It didn't come from his head, it came from his bones. From his father's unfinished conversations, from Frank's quiet hands, from the weight of history and the quiet refusal to let it become dust. He wrote more. "We talk about war like it's a place, but it's not. It's a bridge. Between what was and what should have been. Between who we lost and who stayed behind to carry the rest of the story." He paused again. The pages turned in the breeze. In the distance, a boy's voice called out to someone at the shelter. Keanu smiled faintly. He had thought a lot about what it meant to leave, to go home, to start something new. But the truth was, this place had already become part of him, not just the buildings or the names, but the values, the way Frank moved through the world without noise, the way the children followed him, the way the village watched, never asking him to explain why he stayed, only making space for him to do it. Keanu continued to write, the ink smooth against the paper. Some men are remembered for what they built, others for what they destroyed. But maybe the ones we forget are the ones who simply refused to walk away. He closed the journal for a moment and rested it in his lap. In the distance, smoke curled from a cooking fire. Somewhere a child laughed. The faint hum of a motorbike echoed beyond the far tree line. It was nothing extraordinary, but somehow it was everything. He looked out over the village again, letting the sounds settle into him. He thought of his father. He thought of Frank. He thought of all the men who fought in that war. Some who came home, some who didn't. And some who came home in body but not in spirit. And then he thought of the ones who stayed behind, not because they had to, but because they chose to. The ones who didn't have farewell ceremonies or folded flags. The ones who traded their uniforms for aprons and their rifles for medical kits. Frank wasn't the only one, but he was the one who had taught Keanu that staying could be just as noble as fighting. That showing up every day in a place that no longer made headlines was its own kind of courage. Keanu opened the journal again and wrote one final line. Some men fight for a country, some stay for its people. He looked at the sentence for a long time. Then he underlined it, slowly, once. He didn't need to write anything else. He stood, brushing the dust from his hands, and tucked the journal under his arm. The sun had dropped lower now, turning the sky a shade of orange that looked like it had been painted by memory. As he made his way back along the path, the breeze carried the faint scent of wood smoke and jasmine. The shelter came into view again. It looked stronger now, not just because of the new roof, or the staff, or the resources, but because it had become what Frank had always hoped it could be. A place that outlived him, a place others would carry forward. As Keanu stepped through the gate, a young boy ran up and grabbed his hand. Frank is looking for you," the boy said. "He said the wrench is still missing." Keanu smiled and nodded. He followed the boy into the courtyard. And somewhere behind him, the words he had written settled into the silence. Not as an ending, but as a bridge. Keanu sat alone in his hotel room the night before his flight, the journal still open beside him on the table. The lights were dim. The city outside was quiet. He picked up his phone, opened the recorder app, and hit record. His voice was calm, slower than usual. I thought I came to Vietnam to understand the past, to connect with the shadows that followed my father. But I didn't leave with answers. I left with something better. He paused, collecting the words that had been building in him for weeks. I left seeing the future because I met a man who refused to let history be the final word. A man forgotten by books, ignored by systems, but remembered by everyone who needed him. A long breath. Then he continued. Frank Dawson didn't stay behind to be honored. He stayed because he saw what war left behind and refused to pretend it wasn't still there. He stayed when the funding dried up. He stayed when no one was looking. And now, because he stayed, others are standing. Others are healing. Keanu glanced out the window, then back at the microphone. Helm showed me that heroism isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the man who fixes a faucet for the 5th time in a week, who hums lullabies with a shaky voice, who teaches 3 kids how to bandage a leg like it's sacred. Another pause. And maybe peace isn't silence. Maybe it's just a kind of sound we forgot how to hear. He looked down at the last page of his journal and read softly. Some men fight for a country. Some stay for its people. Then he ended the recording. The screen faded to black, and a single line appeared in white text. Have you ever met someone the world forgot, but who changed your world completely? After a moment, another message followed. Have you ever witnessed a quiet act of heroism? Share your story in the comments. Then came the final screen. What mission should Keanu take on next? Subscribe to follow every step of this journey. And in the silence that followed, the story lingered, not as a conclusion, but as an invitation. The video ended, but the response was just beginning. In the hours that followed its release, the comment section filled with thousands of voices, not loud ones, honest ones. People from all over the world sharing names, stories, memories, letters never sent, thank you never spoken. One woman wrote, my uncle worked in a field hospital during the war. He never talked about it, but he spent the rest of his life fixing old bicycles for kids in our neighborhood. This story made me remember him differently. Another said, there's a woman in my hometown who takes food to veterans every Sunday, even though she's on a fixed income. No one's ever told her thank you. I will now. A retired soldier commented simply, I knew a Frank. We lost touch. I hope he stayed too. Every comment was another echo in the quiet legacy Frank had helped build. No fireworks, no awards, just ripple after ripple from one man's decision to stay. And through it all, Keanu didn't say much. He didn't need to. His voice had already said what mattered. Behind the scenes, the Hope After Silence network grew. A second clinic broke ground outside Hugh. More volunteers signed up. Frank, true to form, never asked to be mentioned again. He just asked for more gauze, more soap, more quiet tools to do the job right. And somewhere, tucked between the journal pages in Keanu's bag, was the final reflection he hadn't read out loud. He wrote it days earlier while walking through the shelter's courtyard. If we're lucky, we meet someone who reminds us that showing up matters more than showing off. That staying matters more than being seen, Frank reminded me. And now I'll remind whoever I can. That was the mission now. Not to leave, to remember. Yeah, to follow the quiet trail of those who stayed behind, on purpose, not because they were stuck, but because they believed healing had to begin somewhere. And for Frank Dawson, it began in a country once torn apart, on a path rarely walked, in a shelter no map marked. But now the world knew, and it would never forget.